Hello, everyone. My name is Max Kanevsky, and I'm the founder of OpenCDISC. And welcome to our second OpenCDISC webinar. The topic of today's webinar are the recently released FDA validation rules. Let me first present our speaker. Our presenter today is Sergey Serchenko. He is a co-founder of OpenCDISC with me. He's also been, for the last couple of years, working as an FDA data fitness analyst. So he has a lot of first-hand experience working with these new FDA validation rules. And if any of you ever used the OpenCDISC forum, I'm sure you remember him as the person who answers all your questions. So let me hand it over to Sergey.
Hi, everybody. There is a common disclaimer. We work for FDA, however, this webinar represents our personal view rather than any FDA official view of policy. In this webinar, we're going to cover overview of new FDA guidances around standardized data, discuss the definition of the data quality, then we're going through the proper structure and content of new FDA business rules for studying data. Then we will show you how to use OpenCDISC Community tool to execute those business rules, and at the end we will do a comparison of FDA business rules to previous version of OpenCDISC validator. During this webinar, you can, if you have any questions, please submit them using the Ask a Question button, which you can find on the left upper corner of your screen, and we will try to address to answer all your questions at the end of this webinar. And if we have enough time, if all questions which cannot be covered will be answered in special document we will publish on our website, in addition to slides and other materials related to this webinar. Okay, there is some quick overview of our FDA regulation documents. There is a recent law, so-called FDA Safety and Innovation Act, which allows FDA to require usage of the standards for submission data. However, all details are provided in supportive guidance documents. For example, version of the standards, standard names, or effective dates for all those standards. Such approach gives FDA flexibility and allow them to do regular updates on regulatory requirements. There are so-called a set of binding documents around submission around requirements for submission data. Guidance on submission data in electronic format is a very high-level document. When guidance on electronic submission standardized study data provide more clear requirements on usage of, for example, CDISC data, and the study data technical conformance guide provide the highest granularity on all these requirements, and also share FDA requirements and expectations on particular usage of submission data. And the recent document which was published 2 weeks ago is FDA validation rules for SDTM data. We're going to discuss in this webinar. This document was published as a part of Federal Registry, and you can find the reference using these links. You can find the set of list of rules on FDA Study Data Standards webpage. And if you have any particular questions or comments, you can please contact FDA data team using this email. This is a screenshot of Federal Register, and I would like to point to a summary for this document which says that FDA is making this document available to improve the standardization and quality of clinical data submitted to CDER, as well as to improve the predictability of the quality and usefulness. It's a very important statement which clarifies the goal and purpose of this new guidance. This is a screenshot of study data standard resources where with highlighted linkage to this FDA-specific SDTM validation rules document. Before going to FDA business rules, I would like to discuss a concept of the data quality. FDA Study Data Technical Conformance Guide defines quality data as both compliant and useful. Compliant means that the data conform to standards. Useful means that the data can support the intended use. And intended use concept is very interesting concept. Even within the agency, there are many different consumers of submission data with different needs and requirements. For example, medical reviewers probably less interested in standard compliance, but they're more interested in finding information about study, about drug safety. Statistical reviewers are more interested in analysis data than medical reviewers. Clinical trial repository has much strict requirements for standard compliance, and if some business rules failed, the data cannot be uploaded in the system. For integrated analysis, you need to have very high compliance with controlled terminology. Otherwise, it makes integration works very time-consuming and resulted in losing of information. Data storage systems probably don't care about all other rules, but they have their own specific requirements. For example, they expect the data to not have any so-called wasted space. That's why FDA have specific rules and ask sponsors to resize the data before submission. I've seen submissions with data package of total size 40 gigabytes when after the appropriate resizing, that size can be reduced up to 2 gigabytes. And it's a huge problem not only for data storage system, but for the general usage of the data. Because you need to transfer this data over the network, over internet CTxxx system, and it's a huge difference. 40 gigabytes versus 2 gigabytes. And even on your local computer, you may have problems with space. Even opening those files may have caused some delays with any analysis tools like SAS. And analysis tools, it's other examples where you may have completely separate, completely different requirements for study data. But it's very important to understand that there is no one single definition of the data quality. There are many users with different requirements, and something can be important for other users but can be quite annoying for other users. And it's very tricky to make 100% clean and high quality data. Coming back to FDA Study Data Technical Conformance Guide, it provides a definition for the data validation process as a set of validation rules that are used to verify that the data conform to a minimum set of quality standards. And it's very important that it allows to identify data issues early. Please know that FDA requires sponsors to validate their study data before the submission and correct any validation errors. Sponsor can explain in the reviewer guide why certain validation errors could not be corrected. It's very important to understand that you can explain why some errors could not be corrected, because I've seen many examples in the reviewer guides when sponsors just either blame data vendors or deny the existence of particular business rules. With the release of FDA validation rules document, it's official regulation document. It's not OpenCDISC validation rules anymore. You need to comply with them because it's required by FDA. Summarizing, I would like to emphasize that the purpose of FDA validation rules is to communicate with the industry on specific FDA requirements and enforce them for submission data. FDA developed those rules based on existing guidance and standards like ICH, Technical Conformance Guide, SDTM, or other FDA-specific needs. Also, FDA try to help industry with implementation of high-quality data. Please remember that sponsors are responsible for quality of submission data. Data quality is not limited to set of any business rules. I personally consider data quality as a population when any set of business rules is a kind of sample of that population. You cannot make like a global assessment of the data quality with any validation checks because it's infinitive set of rules. So published FDA rules are required but not completely sufficient. They will never be final. Please remember this. Other very important things to understand is that FDA rules are specific to FDA needs. CDISC manage standards compliance, and they have special documents like add-on validation rules. They put a lot of business rules in Define.xml specifications. Now CDISC team is finalizing SDTM implementation guide version 3.2 business rules, and in the future they will use business rules as a supplement to any new implementation guide standard. FDA enhanced standard compliance rules with submission-specific business rules. So these FDA rules are some kind of extension to standard compliance rules. Other example is that PMDA, Japanese regulatory agency, will have their own set of business rules very soon. So we have many players in this area, but again, when we're coming back to the concept of intended use, please keep in mind that all those business rules, all those requirements can be specific to particular agency or to particular governor of those standards. Okay. Sorry. This document is the first release of FDA rules. It's based on OpenCDISC checks. FDA introduced additional rules. There are some changes in severity message and descriptions. FDA plans regular updates once or 2 times a year, and you can submit any feedbacks or comments to FDA e-data team. The document is published in Excel format, which is much better than PDF format because it's machine readable. It's most commonly used for metadata, and it's easy to use. You can always provide, your comments, enhance this document with your metadata. And this document has quite standard columns like FDA rule ID, message description, assigned domains, severity of business rules, and applicable standards. This is a screenshot of this document, and you can see all those columns on the top. The document covered all acceptable standards right now by FDA, so it's applicable to SDTM Implementation Guide version 3.1, 3.1.2, 3.1.3, which is also is a part of 3.1.2 Amendment 1. I'm going back to the previous slide, and as you can see, please take a look at upper right corner. As you can see, Amendment 1 is a part of 3.1.3 standard. Amendment 1 is a temporary patch for outdated SDTM Implementation Guide 3.1.2 standard rather than a separate SDTM version. So it's very important, if you're still using Amendment 1 in your submission data, you need to use business rules for SDTM Implementation Guide 3.1.3. SDTM Implementation Guide 3.2 is still under FDA testing and may be accepted by FDA soon. SAND 3. Validation rules for SAND standard will be published as a separate document with consistent FDA rule ID. Then I would like to clarify the concept of severity, which is used in these documents and which is used by OpenCDISC validation tool. By our definition, error is a business rule which must be always true. And there are some examples here, like data consistency issues, missing seriousness criteria for serious adverse event, which is part of ICH requirement, missing domains which are important for review process, like demographics or trial summary. While A warning is a business rule with potential exceptions, and extensible controlled terminology is example. So you can add new terms if they are not synonyms or subset of standard terms. We use notice, which is similar to warnings with a difference in probability of exception. So warning is some rule with potential, where may be some exception and explanation is needed. While notice is a rule where exception is expected and confirmation of validity is needed. Controlled terminology is a good example of a notice we used. However, notice were retired in FDA document due to confusion within industry. We have seen many examples when the user just ignored them. It's a quick overview of FDA documents, and we're moving to OpenCDISC as a tool which allow you to execute those business rules. I think all of you are familiar with OpenCDISC, and just I'd like to remind you that there are many additions to cover all business needs. OpenCDISC Community is a free open source desktop toolkit. Enterprise is commercial, web-based corporate project level solution, and it's what is used by FDA as a data feed tool. And on-demand is a limited project level edition of Enterprise. So we will talk about OpenCDISC Community 2.0, which is free open source tool. The release date for this version is December 11. That new release will include 4 tools. Validator will be enhanced with FDA rules. There is brand new Define.xml tool, which is work with version Define.xml version 2 and utilize Excel as a data entry interface. We also do release of data converter tool, which can move SAS XPT files into Excel, CSV, or dataset XML. And new release of OpenCDISC Community will include clinicaltrial.gov Miner. It's a tool for clinical team to find information on repository of clinical trials. And very important things is that this new release will include automatic updates to keep you up to date with terminology and all changes. We will have special webinar around OpenCDISC Community 2.0, so you can find all details how to use what is new, what tools are available, how to use them, and everything else in 2 weeks. There are 2 sessions. Please register for them. You will expect to receive emails about this webinar in the next couple of days. Okay, so going back to FDA validation configurations. In new release of OpenCDISC Community, FDA configs replace SDTM configs. For example, config SDTM 3.1.2 is replaced by SDTM 3.1.1 FDA. The same is true for other versions, while SDTM 3.2 is still have name without reference to FDA. However, it's allied with other FDA configurations. The same is true about SEND. SEND is aligned with other FDA configs and will be adjusted and renamed for SEND 3.0 FDA after FDA official release of validation rules for SEND not actually release of validation rules, but updates of current sent validation rules on their website. We introduced new attribute for our checks. So actually we have new attribute for configurations as the publisher and publisher ID for rules. In addition to OpenCDISC rule ID, it represents authoring organizations like FDA. In the future it will be PMDA, CDISC, and other. OpenCDISC ID is the same across all configurations, so the usage of OpenCDISC ID and publisher ID can be interchangeable dependent on requirements. Like for example, for the same algorithm, you may have different publisher IDs from FDA, from PMDA, from CDISC, but algorithm will be the same, and OpenCDISC ID will be the same for this rule. And right now, Max Kanevsky will do a short demo how to use OpenCDISC Community to comply with FDA validation rules.
Thank you, Sergey. So as Sergey already mentioned, the new version of OpenCDISC Community, version 2.0, is going to be released on December 11th. We're going to have a special webinar dedicated to go in detail through each of the 4 tools that are going to be available in the latest release. We'll make sure to cover about how to configure it, what are all the different options, and how to use each one of the tools. That email about those webinars will go out actually by tomorrow. So what you see right now is the new OpenCDISC Community tool. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a quick sneak peek, especially of how to use it to validate your data against the latest FDA validation rules. One of the things when you see, one of the big differences obviously is that it's no longer a single tool. There's 4 different tools available. So we have to change the user interface quite a bit. You also see that this is what we call a connected app. So it will keep you up to date with recent updates that are relevant to validation or to the creation of Define.xml. So typically you'll get CDISC implementation guide releases, FDA news, as well as recaps from OpenCDISC Live and OpenCDISC webinar events. And then this will just update for you automatically, and the idea is to keep you up to date with the latest developments. So if you look at the validator tool itself, it's going to look very similar to the existing version. We try to keep the user interface as close as possible, to make the transition easier for everyone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple of things. So if you notice in available configurations for SDTM, you're going to see those 4 different configurations that Sergey mentioned. You have the 3 FDA specific configurations, and you have the SDTM 3.2 that hasn't been approved yet by FDA, but we are providing sort of as an early preview, which is meant to be reconciled as much as possible to the existing FDA validation rules, but once it gets finalized, it's going to get that FDA designation that it currently lacks. So let's pick, let's run through a typical validation. So I have some study. Let's pick so we have the study data that CDISC provides as part of the Define.xml 2.0 standard. That's a pretty good sample data that we typically use in demos. So let me just grab all of that data. So there's 34 different data sets. Let's make sure we select the Define.xml. So as far as dictionaries go, the CDISC dictionaries, CDISC Controlled Terminology is provided with the software. We typically provide the last 5 versions, but we can expand that list if you need to. So I believe this study uses the one from December. We also provide MEDRA, as well as additional dictionaries that we added specifically in this release. So there's a total of 5 different dictionaries that you have to use for, to support the FDA validation rules. There's the CDISC Controlled Terminology, there's MEDRA that's used in adverse events, as well as medical history. And then you have SNOMED, UNI, and NDFRT. Those are used in trial summary. The CDISC, UNI, and NDFRT are actually publicly available dictionaries, and so we're able to bundle them and include them in the release. With MEDRA and SNOMED, if you remember, there are some manual steps that you have to follow in order to basically upload your version of MEDRA and SNOMED, since those require licensing. SNOMED actually does not require any licensing in the United States, but it does require licensing outside of the United States. So unfortunately, we're not able to provide it to you out of the box, but we provide instructions of how you can add it to the system. With those dictionaries, I believe this study uses 8.0. We'll just go ahead and validate. As you can see, this is a very similar process to the way it worked before. So it's complete. It only took 6 seconds. This is very similar statistics that you have seen in the prior tools. Now let's take a look at the report. So there's a couple of changes that you'll notice in the report. One is we provide a lot more information at the top. You get the information about what specific configuration you ran, the defined file that was used, when it was generated, as well as all the different terminology versions that were used, as well as the version of the engine that these validation rules were executed with. This is very useful, especially from the historical perspective. If you ever wonder what was used to execute this particular report, this is one of the enhancements that that users have been asking us for the last year or so. The rest of the report is kept the same except for one major change. Sergey mentioned the introduction of a publisher ID. So the publisher ID is designed, so this is an additional column that's added in addition to the OpenCDISC rule ID that was there before. And these publishers IDs are the IDs that are provided by the governing organization that provides the rules. In the case of FDA, the publisher ID is the FDA-specific ID. So when you actually do a submission and you explain your issues in the reviewer guide, you're supposed to use the FDA IDs in the reviewer guide. But for historical precedent, to make sure that it's easy for you guys to follow, what rule replaces which of the OpenCDISC rules, we will be providing both rules side by side for the foreseeable future. And this particular column has been added to every single tab. So you guys will notice in the Details tab, you have the Publisher ID, and most importantly, on the Rules tab. So if that the FDA published that list of rules, they don't provide the OpenCDISC ID in that list. If you just run a validation, your Rules tab will basically provide exactly the same spreadsheet, but with both IDs available. So this is it for the tool. We're hoping that you'll come out to our webinar on December 11th and December 16th. Those will be identical sessions. And we'll be very happy to showcase the rest of the application. And we're very proud about all the enhancements we were able to make over the last year. And hopefully you'll be able to join us for those webinars. Well, now I'm going to turn it back to Sergey to continue his presentation.
The last part of this presentation is a comparison of FDA validation rules versus OpenCDISC on Data 1.5. So 39 new checks were introduced in FDA business rules for STDM data. All those new checks are around trial summary data. It's very important to understand that trial summary data is considered as one of the key information in submission data by FDA. Please note that, as Max mentioned, that some rules will require the user to set up proprietary dictionaries due to licensing issue. Need to do some manual steps, manual configurations by yourself. All documentation will be provided on our website or within a tool. Okay, there are few removed checks. Some of them were removed due to inconsistency between STM and FDA requirements. And some examples are checks for disposition of data around epoch variable. So implementation guide said that, so this is actually statements from implementation guide business rules, but FDA require to populate epoch for each record. And because all that unclarity and inconsistency, and because a lot of confusion around disposition data in general, those checks were removed by FDA. So right now it's very clear that you need to populate epoch variable for each record in disposition domain. And it's FDA requirement. It's not STM compliance, it's FDA requirement. Some checks were missed for technical reasons and may be added back later. This is example like incorrect value for end study day. There are a couple other checks which will be added in the next, probably the next revision of FDA document. FDA collapse controlled terminology checks. OpenCDISC controlled terminology validation is metadata driven. So to make our life easy, about 350 controlled terminology checks were collapsed into just 6 business rules. There was a reference to those checks in OpenCDISC and FDA document. All these checks are driven by terminology assignments in configurations, similar how it is done in Define.xml, rather than to have a separate check for separate controlled terminology and separate variable or value level. There are many changes in severity. As we mentioned before, OpenCDISC notice is retired with a few exceptions. All extensible code list checks increase to warning from the notice. Severity for about 40 rules increased to error. Couple examples are checks like no records in the data source. So please don't submit any data with 0 records to FDA. Other example is FDA adverse event start date is out of the latest disposition date. And this check is not actually about data entry. It's check about data collection design. This check means that you need to collect the date of the last contact with the subject in disposition domain. Other example is around incorrect case. Like we still see submissions where sponsor converted original term like matter terms or controlled terminology term in uppercase. It's error now. It's not warning, it's just error. You can find detailed reports on all these changes on our blog as a supplement material for this webinar slides. There are many changes in the message and descriptions. FDA did a good job to refine the rule description. It's 58 changes and messages, and this is example like old rule description is variable requested by FDA in CDER. Common data issues document should be included in the dataset. So new description for this rule is variable requested by FDA in policy documents should be included in the data set, for example, APAC and element. So FDA updated this rule with reference from outdated document to more generic reference to FDA policy documents, and they provided examples to make this rule more clearer for understanding. However, the algorithm are still the same for most rules. You can find all details in changelog files within a validator structure, a file structure. And as a summary for this webinar, I would like to say that new FDA validation rules for SDTM data. It's a new guidance document to clarify regulatory expectations. OpenCDISC Community version 2.0 provides executable FDA validation rules for submission data. Sponsors should catch and fix data issues as early as possible. And please remember that OpenCDISC is just a tool. However, your process is also important. If you have any feedbacks or comments, please submit it to FDA data team or post all your questions on our forum or contact me directly. You can follow us on our events like webinars or trainings events using our social media or our blogs or OpenCDISC website. And there is a page with FDA resources around requirements for standardized data for submission. Thank you very much. We will go on to proceed with your questions.
Thank you, Sergey, for this presentation. We did receive quite a number of questions. We'll try to go through as many of them as possible. But before we do, let me just tell you that this webinar is being recorded, and it will be made available on YouTube, just like the previous one. So if any of you had any kind of connection problems or audio issues, you'll be able to see the full webinar on YouTube by early next week. We'll also publish the slides as well as the responses to the Q&A questions on our blog also by sometime next week. So all of this information from this webinar will be available for you for future viewing. All right, so let's start with, the first question was about the availability of a command line interface like in previous tools. Yes, so I know you probably saw the pretty new interface, but we still are supporting the use of the tool from the command line. Both the validator and the data converter currently have a command line interface, so you'll still be able to automate the process if this is the reason why you guys have been using command line interface. We're going to try to keep it up to date as possible, and if you have any specific requests about features in the command line interface that you'd like us to introduce, please send us feedback, and we'll be glad to take a look at them. We had also a couple of questions about the errors versus warnings. So let's reinforce this very important question once again. I'm going to have Sergey just go over this one more time to make sure that it's clear for the audience.
What is the question?
Errors versus warnings.
Severity, it's more technical concept. It's the concept around the algorithm for the business rule. Again, it's more about if it's a very straightforward black and white rule, or there are a couple, or you may have different shades of gray areas. If it's a very strict, if it's a simple rule, yes, with very simple answer, yes or no, it's an error. It based either on, again, some examples of data consistency, or it's a very simple rule, or it's a very simple requirement from FDA, very straightforward requirement, it's an error. If you may have exceptions for this business rule, it's a warning.
Yeah, in general, it's the certainty of the business rule, right? Some business rules are black and white, right? You're missing demographics, or you're missing trial summary. So it's the clarity of the business rule, and the need to comply with it, why it's an error. There's many checks, like, you're missing units for a particular lab test. As everyone knows, it's not possible for the validation check to capture every possible lab test that doesn't have units. So there's always going to be a case of exceptions, and that's why that particular check is a warning. So keep that in mind. It doesn't mean that you should focus any less attention when you're fixing warnings versus errors. You should treat them all the same. It's more as a tool for you to understand whether this is a black and white business rule or this is one that has potential exceptions.
But again, as FDA said in Technical Conformance Guide, all identified validation errors should be fixed or explain why you cannot fix them. So it's very important, this statement. You can only explain why you cannot fix them. And this is a good entry into the next question about exactly what you need to do with the data reviewer guide. The technical conformance guide from FDA is very clear of what you need to do. You need to try to fix as many issues as possible. I think that quote actually came from Amy Mahler many years ago. She said in one of her presentations that you have to fix everything that's possible to fix and explain anything else. So make sure that you're not viewing a reviewer guide as a way to just explain every single issue. If it's a mapping issue or it's a compliance issue that could be fixed, you're expected to fix it. You're not just expected to explain it. So the reviewer guide's purpose is to explain exceptions. It's not the purpose to basically just not having to fix the issues. So make sure you guys understand that distinction. Reviewer guide is designed to describe exceptions. The next question, there's a couple of related questions, and it talks about the different rule sets that are going to be available in OpenCDISC and what will happen to the original CDISC validation configurations. So to begin to answer this question, there's been a common misconception about the source of the validation checks. Even from the first release of OpenCDISC, the validation checks were actually derived from the Janus set of validation checks. So the rules were always sourced from FDA from the very beginning. So if you look at the previous versions of OpenCDISC, it was never about standard compliance. It was a mix of rules. There was some standard compliance rules. There were some data quality rules, like start date should not be after end date. And there was specific FDA requirements, like you have to resize your variables so your data set size does not exceed the 1 gigabyte limit. So there was, if you look at history, it's always been about regulatory requirements. So going forward, really, the only change is instead of OpenCDISC coming up with a list of rules to implement, now these rules become official. So these rules are no longer the responsibility of OpenCDISC. We're just involved in implementing those rules. And because the same exact rules are implemented in FDA, since FDA is using the same OpenCDISC engine, they're just using an enterprise version versus what many people use, the community version, but the engine is the same, and the validation rules that are implemented, that are published as part of the community, are the same exact rules that are executed at FDA. So that's really the only important distinction. So when people say, where is the source of the rules? The source of the rules has always been the regulatory agencies, and
now it just becomes official. So from now on, we will work with the different organizations, including CDISC, as they develop new rules for new standards. And we're going to work with the regulatory agencies like FDA and PMDA to make sure that their business rules are implemented. But now, because there's so many organizations involved in writing the rules, we're very happy. Personally, I'm very happy. Instead of us having to develop validation rules, we can focus on implementing technology. And as you saw briefly, that time was well spent in creating additional tools for the community that you guys can use further to enhance your what you're able to do with our existing tool set. The next question was about cross-data set versus cross-study checks. What type of checks do we have? So we have a lot of different cross-data set checks. So the FDA set of rules include, so all of the referential integrity checks to make sure that all the patients are in every single, so every patient mentioned, every single domain is in demographics. There's rules to ensure that trial arms are in trial arm domain. There's many of these data consistency rules. They always exist in the prior releases, and they are also exist in the FDA set of rules. There's even checks that this is Sergey's leaning forward. I'm sure I know exactly what he's going to say. There's actually a rule that many people were not aware of. When you validate your ATOM data, and if you include your demographics and exposure from SDTM, there will be a there's a couple of cross validation rules that will ensure that all of the records in ADSL actually match the patients and demographics. So when you validate your ATOM data in the future, make sure you include your demographics domain and you include your exposure domain when you run the validations. Now, if you look at cross-study, the community version does not do any kind of cross-study validation checks. So, a common one would be a uniqueness of subject ID across trials within a submission. That check does not currently exist in the community version. The enterprise version does have additional checks that look at consistency across studies within a submission, but the community version is specifically focused on looking at one study at a time. But if you'll notice, those checks are not part of the published list of checks at FDA. There are just some additional checks that are available in enterprise that are just hard to implement with the community version. Another cross dataset check is about adverse events and dispositions. How does that actually work? So you go ahead, take this one. I'm going to see what
adverse events and disposition check. It's a cross-reference check, which actually takes the author of this check takes the date in adverse event record and compare this date with all dates present in disposition for particular subject.
Okay.
We have a question about if FDA rules will be required immediately if they published, or there is some grace period, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
You need to understand that as I said before, any validation rules are not final. And in data fit, FDA use a lot of additional rules. It's always under a development. It's FDA asks you in many regulatory documents. It's also part of reviewer guide template that you need to run your additional checks, validation checks. Sponsor is responsible for the quality of submission data. You cannot just, and FDA try to help you with the most updated set of rules. But again, this set of rules, I would say like 6 months, at least 6 months outdated compared to the business rules which are used for actual validation of your data within FDA due to all that publishing process and everything else. And coming back to examples of sponsors' responsibility for validation rules, I've seen some examples. I will give you some example. I've seen in ISS data there is some check with explanation in your guide that OpenCDISC check is not designed to work with the integrated data, and that's why it was explanation for the data issue. But the problem was that when we adjust our OpenCDISC check, and it's a very easy adjustment just by adding study ID variable in the algorithm, we discovered that 90% of each reported data points disappear, but there are still 10% of original data point issues. So it's not a good practice. If sponsor claim this OpenCDISC is not algorithm is not perfect, if it's a false positive, they need to run their own validation to prove that there is no problems with their data. We have a question about if a PMDA checks will be available.
Right. Yeah. There's a few questions on the topic of PMDA as well as PMDA versus FDA. So PMDA agency are currently in the process of implementing a process in order to basically, so they're just like FDA, they're implementing the OpenCDISC Enterprise platform. They're reviewing all of the existing rules to determine which ones will apply to PMDA, which ones will not. So the expectation is when they're getting closer to launching the system in 2015 and subsequently requiring CDISC submissions in 2016, that they will publish a separate list of validation rules. My assumption they're going to be very similar to FDA, but they could potentially have different severities. They could potentially have, some rules would be removed, some additional rules will be added. It's very important to understand that the set of analysis tools that are being used at FDA will be different from the analysis tools that are using at PMDA. Because of the differences in the tool sets that are being used, there's going to be additional requirements, or there'll be less requirements in one agency versus the other. This is that whole intended use discussion that Sergey has been stressing. There will always be differences. The core compliance with the CDISC standards will be the same. So, the sort of CDISC is the base for all of these regulatory agency requirements. The thing that will be different is, analysis-specific requirements. For example, PMDA and FDA has two different clinical data repositories. FDA has something called JANUS, and PMDA, actually I don't recall the name, but they have their own data warehouse, and those data warehouses are structured differently. So, the requirements for those data warehouses will most likely be different, and that will affect the rules that are being published. There's another question about...
The last question, because it's way
right, so we'll take one or two more questions. And who drug? So this is a good question. Go ahead, Sergey.
We're going to add all dictionaries in our tool over time. So who drug will be added in our validation later, in the next releases.
Yeah, we were actually planning to do it in this release. We just ran out of time. It's also a proprietary dictionary, so we just had to figure out the appropriate manual steps that you have to follow in order to set it up. But it will be introduced in the near future. And finally, just one more question before we sign off. There was a question about who decides on the severity. Those decisions are made exclusively by the regulatory agencies. So we call them the consumer of data. Only the consumer of data can decide what's important to them and what's not. OpenCDISC does not make any decisions about the severity of the rules. And we actually, in the past, we try to do our best based on the feedback we're getting from different organizations, but from now on, OpenCDISC is not involved in deciding what the business rules are or what the severities are. We're plainly just implementing the rules that are handed down to us by the regulatory agencies as well as by the standard development organizations. So with this, right, so it's a direct implementation. One thing it's important to understand is this is a direct implementation of the rules that are published. This is exactly the same executable code that is executed at the regulatory agencies. So you should feel comfortable using these rules and expecting the same results when you do your submission. So once again, to wrap it up, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. This has been by far our largest webinar and event that we have conducted so far. We're looking to do this more and more in the future.
And watch our blog for the answers for all questions you submitted. Right.
You'll be getting an email early next week with the link to the video posted on YouTube, the slides from the presentation, and the summary of our answers from the questions that were submitted. Thanks again, and thanks again, Sergey, for the presentation.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.